Hi, my name's Michael Lee. I'm one of the directors in the Forensic Insurance Division of Vincents Chartered Accountants, and I'm joined here today by James Thorburn, who is one of our up-and-coming stars and is an associate in our insurance division. Today we're going to talk about the assessment of damages in compensation to relatives claims or dependency claims, and I suppose what we're going to talk about is to essentially challenge what has been some long-standing sort of approaches as far as how people have calculated damages and particularly the loss of financial dependency. So we're going to sort of step through that today and show you exactly why we think that the traditional approach that's been used over a number of years is not the best way of doing it, and secondly, exactly how we think that you should calculate those losses. So, as far as an overview, the first thing to understand is that a person who expects that they would be dependent upon the deceased is actually entitled to claim for damages for a loss of benefits as a result of the negligence of a defendant. And essentially there are two major components as far as those damages that you can claim. The first being a loss of financial support or a loss of financial dependency, and the second is a loss of services, be they parental or domestic services that would have been provided by the deceased to the dependents. Now, that head of loss in itself does have some quite interesting characteristics and some interesting ways of valuing those services. But today we're really just going to focus with regard to the loss of financial support. So as far as the loss of financial benefits are concerned, the underlying principle is that you are entitled to claim for a loss of the reasonable expectation of financial benefits. Now, I use that word reasonable expectation because it is what you expected would be provided to you, not necessarily what was provided to you at a point in time. And that's quite important in some cases where, for example, you may have dependents of differing ages or differing personal circumstances, and also understanding that not necessarily that the deceased may have been working in one particular occupation at a time, but may have changed that occupation into the future. Now, the most common approach that you'll come across is that the deceased's notional income has to be estimated, and then you take from that allowance for personal consumption. And James will talk a little later about what we exactly mean when we're talking about personal consumption and the types of things that we're talking about. There is a second other approach, and that's normally where there are specific financial benefits that existed or would have existed. The most common is probably child support, where there is a family that is split, and that split family, it's the children that are dependent upon the deceased, and the level of that financial benefit is probably just a child support up until the age of 18 years or of that nature. So the first thing is, in doing this, is always to work out what the deceased's notional earnings are. And you should just remember that it's the usual principles that we use. So we'll look at it and we'll say this is what they were doing at this particular point in time, and this was what was expected would have occurred but for the accident or the incident. And you'll take account of all the usual things such as career progressions and other benefits that people may have had in that occupation. The second part is then to estimate the deceased's personal consumption. Essentially there are three main approaches that have been used over the years. The first is a rule of thumb, and that is not really used in Australia too much, but it is used in the United Kingdom a lot. And essentially it's just where they say if you've got X number of children, well, it's this portion, you know, it might be 20% or 30%, and so on. The second one is the actual expenditure approach, which essentially tries to look at the deceased and their individual consumption habits and tries to estimate exactly what is a good dollar figure to be used for that person's personal consumption. It's probably a more difficult, and I know that a lot of people sit there and think that it requires looking at things like checkbooks and bank statements and credit card statements and things of that nature. I'd say to you that actually it's that isn't a good approach to use at all, because anybody can pick up a bank statement and see on it, for example, that $200 was spent at Woolies, but what you can't tell from that is exactly what was spent of that $200 on the deceased. So typically, and in the cases that I've been involved in, and perhaps in particular the case of French and QBE, where we looked at exactly what was being spent, it was done with reference to a very detailed statement about the person's living habits and things of that nature. So in absence of the actual expenditure approach, the way that courts have traditionally done the estimation of personal consumption is by way of statistics. And probably the most known statistic is what's known as the Table 9.1 in Professor Luntz's text on the assessment of damages, wherein he states what essentially are called dependency percentages. So the statistical approach that we're talking about, and it's often adopted, as I said, because actual expenditure is difficult to obtain or estimate, has been done with reference to these things called dependency percentages. Now, the thing to understand about dependency percentages is really what they are is 100% less personal consumption as a percentage of income. It goes back to that first principle that loss of dependency is equal to income less consumption. So that's always been the approach. Now, since 2002, the percentages that have been in Professor Luntz's book, they were actually prepared by an actuarial firm in Melbourne called Kunston Sargent. And essentially what they did was they used some very broad expenditure groups, and then they assumed that throughout each income level that people would consume essentially the same percentage no matter what the income level happened to be. So you could say that if you were at the lower end of the income scale, it would assume, for example, that 34.4% of your income was spent on personal consumption. Equally, it assumed that at the very end levels that people who were extremely high income earners would equally spend 34.4% of their income on personal consumption. Now, we'll go through this in a second, but we really don't think that that bears out at all.
Alrighty, so when we assess and calculate using the statistical approach, as well as when we use the actual expenditure approach in calculating loss of dependency, there are two broad, I guess, categories that we consider, which are the non-divisible and the divisible expenses. Now, food is the prime example we have of divisible expenses in that subsequent to the death of the deceased, these expenses will typically decrease on a household level. In the case of food, it's just to take account of the fact that there is one less member of that household. Other examples include clothing, alcohol and tobacco in instances when the deceased either drank or smoked, recreational expenses, personal care costs, and motor vehicles if the deceased had his own motor vehicle. Now, typically when we receive instructions surrounding actual expenditure, we go through our instructions and we divide each category of expense into either divisible or non-divisible. So, yeah.
So going back to this point is that historically we've always, people have applied percentages which assume that there is constant consumption. So no matter what particular group that you're in, your consumption would stay the exact same as a percentage of after-tax income. Now, what we've found is that the evidence actually suggests otherwise. And what it shows is that, yes, higher income earners do spend more on consumption as a dollar figure, but they actually spend less as a percentage of their after-tax income. So the best example probably is exactly food. And this is what the Australian Bureau of Statistics figures show with regards to food consumption as a percentage of household income. It shows that people at the very lower income spectrum spend approximately 35% of their income on food consumption, whereas at the other end of the income spectrum, households typically spend around about 10% of their income on food consumption. Now, this being the case, and as James said before, that food consumption is divisible. It is personal consumption. You'd have to question why it is that you would use a model that assumes that there is constant consumption when all the evidence suggests otherwise. So, what does the approach that we use these days, and you can find it on our website. If you go under my profile, you'll see the paper itself. And essentially what it does is this. It uses the latest detailed data from the ABS. So whereas the paper that was originally done by Cumston Sargent, it had reference to about 7 categories of expenditure. The approach that we use actually uses in excess of 120 items of expenditure, and we analyse those 120 plus items of expenditure. What we then do is we look at it based on each income group, and essentially what they call deciles. So every 10% as you go along on the different income. We focus purely on personal consumption. So whereas the previous data, these broad expenditure groups had some items that were, for example, in their non-divisible expenses, but treated them as personal consumption, the additional data now allows us to focus purely on that personal consumption. The other part of the approach that we use, instead of using dependency percentages, but instead look at personal consumption percentages, is that it allows you to actually put a bit of a reasonable estimate as to, is this right? Does this seem right? And to give you an idea, I was just worked in a case just recently where under the old approach, it was assumed that the deceased spent between $3,500 and $4,000 a week on personal consumption. Now, in that particular circumstance, I'm sure that we'd always, like to give that a bit of a nudge, but it's a very high amount of money to spend on yourself personally, as opposed to the benefit for the rest of the family. So this will allow you to put that into context. And the final thing is that it implicitly takes account of what's known as the pooled income approach, which essentially says that if you have two members of a household who derive income, then each person has a cross-dependency on each other. One person has a dependency level on that amount of income, and similarly the other person has a level of dependency on the other person's income. So what we get these days is just a couple of series of tables, and I'm not going to go exactly through these numbers, other than to say that if you have a look at these numbers, what you'll see is a trend. And essentially the trend is that the lower the income, the higher personal consumption is as a percentage of that income. And as you trend up in the income stakes, that personal consumption decreases as a percentage of income, such that you're starting at essentially 44% and going down to about 13.4% of after-tax income. Now, that contrasts to the old tables, which essentially said that you spent 34.4% of your income on yourself. So you can see that there are some pretty vast changes. The second one here is a table is just with regards to one-parent families, and the reasons why that these percentages of personal consumption are higher are that there are certain items which are adult expenditure that would be completely saved upon the death of the deceased. So what I'll do now is I'll just explain. This is just the mathematical formula of how you do it. So the first part is obviously to determine the deceased personal consumption. What you then do is you determine the before and after tax pool of income, so such that you take account of taxation. You identify then what is the appropriate percentage that you should be adopting for personal consumption, and you multiply the after-tax pool of income by that percentage. You then look at the deceased's notional after-tax income, and you deduct from it that personal consumption that we worked out in the first place. So it's essentially a three-step process of how you would work this out. So I'll get James now to run through one of the examples and show you how this actually would be done.
Alrighty. Now for this first example, we've got the before and after tax income pool just at the top of the screen there. And as you can see in this example, we've assumed that this household also has 2 children. Now the first step is going to be using the tables in the paper just to come up with a personal consumption percentage of 12.4%, as you can see there. Now that is obviously a little bit lower than the previous consumption percentages stated in the Luntz handbook. And by utilizing that percentage that we've adopted, the 12.4%, we then use that to calculate out the loss of financial dependency at step 3 at the end there.
Now I think the important part that should be taken from this is that we're looking at this and we're saying that our estimate of personal consumption is $250 per week. So you need to sort of put into context this $250 per week. I mean, For a person that earns $917 after tax per week, would spending $250 per week on themselves appear to be a reasonable type of estimate? Because what the other approach would say is that it is actually much, much higher and probably up around about $400+ per week under the old approach. So by doing this, you're getting a bit of an idea as to whether or not that personal consumption amount is actually a reasonable estimate.
Alrighty, now for the second example, we've got a husband-wife household family with just one child. So using the same sort of approach as before, we use the tables to come up with a personal consumption percentage of 13.1%, which estimates the consumption of the deceased as $336 per week. We then use that personal consumption amount in conjunction with the deceased's income to calculate out a loss of dependency of $947 per week. Again, just to put that in context, it's comparing a personal consumption of $336 a week compared to the deceased's income of approximately $1,300. Now, obviously those were quite generic examples, and there are some instances where adopting that statistical method may not be appropriate. Now, one that we've always come across is the personal habits of the deceased. If they were a heavy drinker or a heavy pack-a-day smoker, we have the statistical tables that we've calculated are just an average, and they don't take account of every factor that the deceased may have. So in instances where the deceased is abnormal in comparison to the statistics, if they are a heavy smoker or if they're not a smoker at all, we would obviously factor that in to our calculations.
And it's one of these things that we were saying is that statistics, all they can ever do is give you an estimate based on the average. And what you should do is you should look at these things and these numbers and adjust them accordingly. There's one case called Cremona, RTA in Cremona, a New South Wales decision, where they did the exact same thing. They worked out what the dependency percentage was, and then they said, let's adjust this to take account of the following things we know about the deceased. So you should always keep in mind that these numbers that we're coming up with here, which are what the personal consumption estimates are under the statistical approach, can be at any point in time adjusted upwards or downwards to take account in some way the deceased's personal habits. So what we should just show you here is that where we work through and we say, for example, that a person was making their weekly income for the household was $1,200 per week, what you're doing is you're looking at this 5th and 6th decile. This is where the $1,200 fits in. And what it essentially says is that anyone in between those numbers at $1,200 probably has statistically personal consumption in a household just of a husband and wife between $233 and $268 per week. So you can use this table as well to get a bit of an idea and say, look, it's between this and this, but after taking account of the following factors, we're going to adopt this particular number. And similarly, there's the other tables with regards to one-parent families. So the approach that we've talked about here, where we look at consumption, there is another part to this, which is that if we're looking at the consumption of the deceased whilst they were working, we equally need to take account of the fact that there will be savings of personal consumption between the time that they would have retired and then they would have died. Now, this is rather a contentious sort of issue, because this is a part that can be quite difficult to estimate, and you really need to consider whether or not an allowance should actually be done with regard to this. What you might need to do also is consider whether or not there are other benefits that should have been taken account of during the retirement period. And for example, it may be that that the deceased might have been entitled to a part pension or something like that that has been lost. So there are a myriad of factors that need to be taken into account as to whether or not what that post-retirement consumption amount is, and whether or not you should be taking account of it as a full amount. So it needs to be, again, adjusted for lifestyle. So it might be, for example, that you were making, $80,000 a year, but during your retirement, that amount might actually come down to being only $40,000 per year. So the consumption rate that you've used whilst they were working may not actually really be an amount that you should use later on whilst they're in retirement. So these are the types of things that need to be thought about, and at the moment I'm doing a little bit of research as to trying to get an idea of what people have done as far as their personal consumption during their retirement is, and hopefully by either the end of this year or early next year I may have that research done such that I can have a paper that explains what statistically people consume during their retirement. Now, the other thing that needs to be taken into account as far as a loss of financial dependency is any benefits that may accrue as a result of the death of the deceased. And particularly these are what we call accelerated benefits. Essentially what it means is that a person now receives the full benefit of an asset as opposed to deriving the benefit when the deceased would have ordinarily have died. So there is essentially an acceleration and of the benefit that they would obtain. The thing to keep in mind is that it's very much a fact-based assessment, and you need to understand whether or not a benefit is actually accrued. There may be an acceleration of ownership, but has it really conferred a benefit to the dependents? And you need to look and see, is there a change of form over substance? Now, there are a couple of cases, Black and Walden, a New South Wales Court of Appeal decision, and Coolawine and Folk, which is a Queensland decision that have dealt with this. The big thing to understand is, with regard to accelerated benefits, is to look whether or not a benefit has been conferred and whether or not that asset has been used in a different way than what it would have been intended in any event. Probably the basic example would be if you had a holiday home and you were out at Wynnum and had a holiday home overlooking the water, and that you only ever just used that as a holiday home on weekends or something like that because you lived in the city. If you continued to use that asset in the exact same way, where the dependents just went out on the weekend and used that, then you wouldn't have an accelerated benefit, because the asset is used in the exact same manner as it was prior to the death of the deceased. If, however, after the death of the deceased, you actually decided to put that onto the market and rent it out, well, in that case, there is a change in the in the asset, and what that means is that you would take account of it as far as an accelerated benefit. There is a couple of other things to remember, that there are some benefits that are specifically excluded. They typically are life insurance, superannuation, and the family home. So if you come across items where, for example, as a result of the death of the deceased, there was a life insurance policy which was paid out, that amount does not go or is not offset against the loss of financial dependency. And the same goes with any superannuation that was received, or the fact that you now own the family house outright, as opposed to two people owning the family home. So essentially that's where we are as far as an overview of loss of financial dependency. I do understand that sometimes these things aren't exactly easy to do over a webinar and are better talked about on a personal sort of level. So anybody who has any questions that they would like to understand, or how the method is used, by all means, what I'd suggest is that you send an email to me at mlee@vincents.com.au, and I'm more than willing, take your question, give you a call, run through any circumstances that you might have, and hopefully be able to explain, perhaps in a more personal context, of how this approach works and how to calculate those losses. So if you do have any questions, by all means, please email me after this, and I will get back to you and have a talk to you about it. So thanks very much.